Welcome back to Reformed Millennials, the podcast where finances, economic trends, and sports intersect. Cam and Joel help listeners better invest their time and money. Also, it's important for listeners to understand that investing in equities, fixed income instruments, and/or alternative asset classes involves substantial risk of loss. Any action you may take as a result of the information presented in this podcast is your own responsibility. The information in this podcast is presented as a general educational, informational, and entertainment resource only. While Joel is registered to provide investment advice, this podcast does not provide individualized investment, tax, or insurance advice, nor is it meant as a recommendation to any listener to buy or sell any specific securities or otherwise take any other form of investment action. This is an excerpt of the full legal disclaimer that's available on the landing page of this podcast, which includes whether Cam Pitchers or Joel Shackleton have any ownership or interest in the specific securities discussed in this podcast.
All right, Joel, welcome back. Another week.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Another, I thought, actually, was going to be the worst performance of the year for your Dallas Cowboys, and they end up.
We pumped them.
Yeah.
Dak showed up.
Did a great job. Huge win. Now, there was one thing I kind of left that game. So for those that don't follow the NFL as closely as Joel and I here, it was Dallas versus Los Angeles Chargers. I guess the lesser of the two Los Angeles teams. It's probably fair to say.
They haven't
but
won
still
a
an
Super Bowl
LA
recently.
team. Like SoFi Stadium, massive, huge build-up. That was a huge marquee matchup for the NFL. I would say the game wasn't like terribly exciting.
No.
As a Cowboys fan, obviously you're invested. But as a sports bettor every weekend, I'm like, okay, where are the offensive juggernauts? Those are the people I want to bet on, bet the overs. Life's way too short to bet the under.
No.
Always bet the over. You always want to cheer for something to happen, not for something to not happen. I go into those games. Obviously, the betting aspect always keeps you intrigued and like makes you watch into the end, especially if it's debatable heading into the second half. One thing that I saw a couple debates online. One was with some guys from Barstool, and then actually there was a similar conversation happening on another kind of sports conglomerate. And these are from people who are like very pro NFL in terms of like that's what takes up most of their airspace when they're speaking about sports. And they're like, how many good games are there a week? Like how many good NFL games there are? And maybe it's more pronounced this year, but like I kind of took a step back and said the same. Like I'm a fan of the Green Bay Packers. We've had 0 good games this year. They're all just grind out wins or like blow losses or whatever. If you're just like a casual fan, if you're not, or sorry, I shouldn't say casual fan, but if you're a fan of the game versus, I guess, your team, and a lot of people are because of like fantasy, and we've talked about this, at lengths over a bunch of different topics about why the NFL is so successful. But the actual product of the game, it's almost like they've been able to say that doesn't matter anymore, as long as we have maybe like 1 or 2 good ones every week. Some good matchups. They have the ability to flex games into
So are
prime
they
time.
reffing this into it not being a fun season?
Well, I don't know if it's the reffing or if it's...
Or is it the
truly
incentives to the team to produce wins in a different fashion?
Yeah, well, I mean, like we always say, like in the NHL and NBA, anything that's exciting gets coached out of the league.
Yeah.
So there could be pieces of that. I feel like some of it, too, is just the... potentially just one of those anomalies where talent is not coming through as much as it used to, just because we talked about the change in the game. It's gone from, we talked about a few weeks ago when the league was starting off, running backs so we're holding out because of them not getting paid fair market value, and a lot of that, I think, can be based on the fact that the game has changed so much. It's turned into a passing game, has turned into even more quarterback centric, where those guys are slinging it, and you need to have star wide receivers. And typically, if you're passing the ball more, that usually means, bigger plays, more excitement. I think at times, obviously, if that doesn't come to fruition, then you got a lot of 3 and outs. You got a lot of punts. Potentially, if, again, talking about how many elite QBs there are, maybe not as many as we first thought, just based on the results. And it was interesting. I mean, I'm not obviously willing to say after 6 weeks or whatever it's been that we're seeing a complete downgrade in the product. But it is interesting seeing, again, these were all like Americans, and I think like as much as baseball is their national sport, like NFL is what everybody's invested in from a pro standpoint. And then I don't know, it was interesting hearing that, because I would have never that kind of conversation I didn't think was really prevalent. And we're seeing that obviously at times, though, like their broadcast numbers are not going anywhere. They're huge, they're massive. It's just whether or not we're actually being enthralled or enjoying the product on the field, and whether or not that's actually the important thing. Is like, oh, was that a good game, or did I hit my parlay and my fantasy team win? And I feel like that's just such I've said it 1,000 times, I know, but it's just, that's so interesting to me that you can just have that pull still without having to rely so heavily on the actual product of your game.
Yeah. As a Dallas Cowboy fan, it's because our quarterback isn't good, and that's why it's not fun. However, I think back to the heyday of the NFL, which I think was the last 5 years of Brady, and then you had the upcoming of the next Brady and Patrick Mahomes, and then you had what seems to be a better who's the guy in Cincinnati?
Joe Burrow.
Yeah. Who's had a rough year this year so far. I mean, he did just throw 3 or 4 TDs to Chase there last week. But nonetheless, it has been kind of a nothing burger year. Really tough schedules for a lot of the good teams also coming out the gate, where they're playing each other a lot, which I think maybe has a little bit to do with it. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, I tend to agree. I always assume if the Cowboys are even in somewhat of a match or game going into the final quarter, we're going to lose. So I've been tuning out a little bit. A nice surprise last week, but yeah, I
think ultimately it's like we know that this is or they've realized too, and I think more leagues are maybe starting to realize it in new products, or the way that they're delivering the game is changing. They're in the entertainment business.
Nothing can be as bad as the F1 season, so I don't really care.
And their numbers are still ridiculous. So the fact that, again, it's how you've obviously, maybe, long term, you can't have a bad product for a long time with no competition or without a ton of excitement, because obviously, as we've talked about before, the fracturing of our attention span, there's so many different options. But if they've glued you in with other things, if I didn't tune in and still making a buck off you.
Honestly, man, if I didn't have football, I don't think I'd watch anything of relevance that other people watch, and I don't know what I'd talk to them about. It's kind of sad. If I didn't have kids and football, or I guess in some cases hockey, what the heck am I even talking to people about anymore? It's a terrible position to be in. I think life was better when we only had a certain amount of content that we all consumed at the same time. We all were more cultured. We had more or less the same opinions. Now, good God.
I think, that's a larger conversation for sure. I was thinking about the other day too, I think being informed, it's just such a thin line, I guess, in understanding and like we're getting information, or information that you are reading and consuming. I'm assuming there's some great studies on the mental health aspect and the anxiety levels of people. I find myself I got to remind myself all the time when I'm scrolling, whatever it might be, especially right now. We're living in a pretty hostile time with information, and I don't think we're really going to get into that today, but just reading that stuff, the effect that can have on your day-to-day, and just the macro level news event items that you're not okay, well, I'm not there, it's not affecting me that way, but what does this mean long term, what does this mean short term? And you start asking yourself all these sometimes irrational questions, but they still have to have an effect on you. And again, I guess it's hard for me to compare because I wasn't an adult under the old.
Still, I'm not. So
still, I'm not. But I wasn't an adult under the old news regime or the old information cycle to understand. Was the same thing happening? It was just us picking up our parents picking up the Edmonton Journal.
No, Walter Cronkite, when he came on TV, everyone listened, everyone believed him, everyone trusted him. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why I don't think we'll ever see a return to these news moguls that are...
Canada's making sure that's going to happen with Bill C, whatever it was.
C-18?
Yeah.
Yeah. The last 5 or 6 popular bills that have hit the floor in Canada have been an absolute abomination, which I think we'll probably touch on a little bit today with Bill C-69. Not a ton, but I just want to kind of go over it. And this is, I don't know, my crappy transition into what I want to actually speak about today.
The other thing you can talk about other than sports
is inflation, which is so fun because we've talked about it for 3 years. And this is what happens when you print too much money or create too much liabilities that you just hand into the hands of poor allocators. Anyways, the data that came out on Tuesday, I think, Trevor Toome had a fantastic little tweet thread that, with pictures, as I often need, he shows where we're headed. And you know what? It's pretty darn, I would say, tangible in terms of the direction it's going. So I'll just kind of whip off a couple of the data points here. So despite acceleration in gasoline, the overall pace of price growth slowed to 3.8% in September, so that's year-over-year numbers. That's down from 4% in August. On a monthly basis, the seasonally adjusted change in core inflation in September was negative 0.1%. So usually we would see a increase in the price of goods over this month-over-month time frame. Despite the rise in energy's contribution to inflation, the main reasons for this decline are coming from all of the areas you want to see it. Because oftentimes you will see a X energy inflation number. So groceries, communications, flights, all contributing to the decline. Those are all the items that we want. I'm guessing this isn't because the NDP went after our grocery stores. I'm assuming that's not the case. But it is good to see that the most important input that is in our control, in my opinion, so that being groceries, the communications, the cost of flights, the cost of the rest of the basket, because I don't care who you are, we should understand as I don't know, what are we, 6 or 7% of global oil reserves? We don't have control over the price of energy, no matter how much we like to think that our federal government does. We just don't. So that is out of our control. No matter how much we raise interest rates, we'll never be able to get oil to $50. So when you look at the Bank of Canada's, I don't know, the future 1 year of the interest rate, at it being prime being, what is it, 7.2 right now, I think that the overnight lending rate in the fives, I think we've hit peak interest rates. I think we're there.
Okay, somebody clip that.
Yeah,
and then
why?
We can have a TikTok of you saying
but
that.
Why? But why? So DataTrek had a really great thread, and they talked to, and the first thing they put is this asset class quilt of total return. Yeah. And the last 24 months or 2 years, we've had a historic sell-off in bonds. This is the worst performance we've seen, worse than 2009. We had a 15.7% drawdown in bonds, U.S. bonds last year, and that pain has continued this year, and it's gone up the curve. So if we were to then look at bonds like we usually look at equities, equities are easier. Everyone understands it. More people own them. Bonds are something that older people usually move themselves into. It's not deemed to be something interesting or that you can make money on. Our generation doesn't even know what it feels like to make money on owning debt. So it's hard for us to conceptualize this. But we just saw a massive sell-off, 50% in 20-year treasuries. And nobody's clamoring that we should be buying this, that the risk is still too high, that the recession, the higher for longer. This is literally, we're going to be broke forever. We're never going to fix our recession. But in bonds, it feels like, and this is not investment advice, by the way, it feels like we are capitulated and that the interest rates are going to continue to go higher, that deficits are going to get bigger, and that we're perpetually screwed. And for the last 100 years, that is a horrible take. Now, don't get me wrong, this late 70s, early 80s, when we had when your parents talk about their 18% inflation, we had a resurgence, and that's the reason why we had to get rates that high. We had a resurgence of inflation. Maybe we see that again. I'm not suggesting that it's impossible. I'm just saying that if you've had two historically bad years, oftentimes that's a buying opportunity. Now, I haven't seen that show up in hedge fund allocations, which is usually where I want to see it before I make any sort of broad-based statement here. But I think we're inching up on what is likely to be a pretty damn fat pitch for people that think long-term. And that is, you don't think the world's going to end. You believe that we're going to return to normalcy in terms of inflation. I'm of the opinion that we are at significant interest rates above going inflation. So what does that mean? We have inflation at 3.8%. We have cost of money at 5.5 or 5.25. We have a huge gap there, which we haven't seen in a very long time. And that, to me, should be sufficient to thwart any sort of hot environment, with the exception of, again, we can't control energy costs. I don't know. It feels like energy or inflation's easing. I think that we're returning to normalcy. The 2% number is far away. Don't get me wrong. We're still 1.8% away from that. But something below 3%, our Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve in the United States has done a very good job getting to positive real rates. Positive real rates, again, is the cost of money being above the rate of inflation. In 2022, we had 8.9% inflation, 9.1% inflation. We had interest rates at 1%. That's a negative delta. So for me, this feels like we're getting close. It feels constructive. It feels like this is a good place to enter in terms of the market. So don't get me wrong. I believe that any sort of sell-off in bonds here is going to be painful short term. But if you have a long-term view on this, it feels really constructive to me. When you start to pull out the cost of mortgages, those sorts of things, prices have really returned to a normal inflation rate. We're going to have to probably deal with the turnover in people renewing their mortgages. I think that's going to be incredibly painful, and it's going to reverberate as a lag.
Yeah,
and
prayers up for your boy. November. Or next November.
Well, we just made our first mortgage payment like 4 days ago. It was awesome.
Whoopsie.
Not even living in the house, and I had to pay for it. So
I think, I think a lot of that stuff is, there's positives you can take out of, so again, Trevor's tweet thread is really good, and I think the way that you summed that up, or what was some takeaways that you personally had, I think that's really good. I think the other thing, and you've alluded to this before, and talking about equities and how, okay, well, if your stock price drops by 50% in order to get back to, and you bought it at the high, it takes X more percentage, to get you back up to where you were to get even money, and you need to understand that. Same, obviously, kind of math applies here. Like we've gone, our inflation number has gone up so quickly over a short amount of time, and from a lot of different facets that are contributing to inflation. So like Trevor goes on to say, like, the slow-moving nature of the inflation calculation is important to keep in mind. If inflation is already back to target right now, we won't see the headline return to 2% for some time. So again, it's going to be a continued topic of discussion. I think you do want to make sure that we're reviewing the kind of the monthly CPI data to stay on track with it. Because if you were to look at it over a year or a longer time frame, you can sometimes get things a little bit misconstrued. So it's just important to understand that I don't think this is, as you point out, maybe we're at a high point. Maybe we're seeing kind of peak inflation. Maybe we're seeing peak interest rates. But the not original rhetoric, I'm going to say some people's original rhetoric around there being cut immediately isn't necessarily going to come to fruition.
No, if you're renewing next week or even in the next 6 months, I'm not sure. Not going to be a great time. However, I've made a couple bets in my private life that I think that in 2 years it's going to look significantly different. And
so your financial advice is
don't take my financial
variable
advice.
1 year.
Yeah. Only take it in private, or if you're a client of mine. So that leads me to bank stocks, because in Canada, that's the only thing people like to talk about. That, and if you're in Alberta, oil companies, but they're two different beasts. And I've had a lot of people ask me this question, or I've seen a lot of advisors even in RBC talking about this, because it is such a heavy allocation for a lot of people in Canada. Own the banks, it's always done well. They pass on inflation really well. They are able to pass on costs to customers. It's just a very strong business. They don't have a lot of competition. It's a great place to be. Mm-hmm. However, the equity of banks has been a challenging own for most. It's never been a heavy allocation for me. However, a return to a yield curve that isn't inverted, so a positive sloping yield curve, is the perfect time to be owning these stocks, because, and this is the same thing with utilities, they have the ability to borrow money cheaply. And if you have an inverted curve, they make money on lending it to you long term. They get to borrow it at the short end, lend it for a very long period of time, and then they have a huge profitability there. They leverage it 15 times, and then they lend it to you over 35, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And when you have an inverted cost of capital, it's a terrible business. But if you have a reinitiation of reversion, which we're seeing right now. So TLT is down 50%. That means the yield has skyrocketed. And for the longest time, we were sitting in 1.5, 2.5 on like 10 through 30-year debt, and it was tough for banks to make a ton of money. So they got their dividends are higher than the going rate at the Bank of Canada. So you have like a 5.8 to 6.5% dividend yield on the bank stocks. And a lot of advisors don't know how to answer this question. And I'm just like, the reason why they're that high is because you need to have an equity risk premium. So the equity prices have to come down sufficiently to compensate the investor. So the dividend has to be higher than the Government of Canada, because the Government of Canada is a better risk than banks. So if it's not higher, the equity is too high. It needs to come down. So that's the reason why you're paying this price. That's the reason why the stock's that high. However, if their profitability can come back up, that the equity risk is worth it, you need to see an inversion of the yield, or you need to see a reversion or acceleration of the curve. Mm-hmm. And I think if we got any sort of cut on the front end, so the Bank of Canada being like, we're going to cut 100 basis points because we deem we need to do this over the next 3 or 6 months, you're going to see a better yield curve for banks, and that's when they're going to start to perform really well on the equity front. It'll be like a leverage bet on rates coming down. And personally, if you're an advisor listening to this podcast, that's how you should be explaining it to your clients. Buying banks here is a bet on banks or the yield curve returning to normalcy. And it's going to be a really great opportunity for people. And I'm not saying this is not financial advice. It just, that's, if we saw a return, that's the only way you're going to see the prices go up, because that's historically how it's worked. So I feel like I had to answer that question, at least in my opinion. That's how you would answer it appropriately. Anyways, from a market update perspective, equities have been struggling. The VIX has spiked up to 20 yesterday. A lot of that came from the good news is bad news and bad news is good news in the United States. So what does that mean? What am I referring to? So they had the beige book come out where the Fed's speaking at noon today. This podcast will go out tomorrow morning. But so in past time, it'll be 24 hours prior to this. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing Powell's going to speak to this beige book, which is effectively where they deem the economy to be going. And it was higher for longer. And that means equities are going to be put under pressure because the cost of capital is going to be higher for longer, and you need to model that into your discounted cash flows. And that's literally the reasoning for it. So you saw equities reprice. You saw bonds be volatile. Mm-hmm. And because of the Middle East tensions, you saw gold and oil do really well. And historically, during drawn-out wars, oil prices do poorly. I don't know if anyone remembers the 20 years that the United States was in the Middle East for, but oil prices, while still volatile, were not 150 for 20 years. They were at 150 for 2 years. So it's my opinion that the reasoning for a lot of that was because of those tensions. It's because of this beige book that came out where they are effectively saying we're going to be higher for longer, and this is a way in which they can continue to put pressure on the costs of or the power that employees have, and then the cost of goods, because it's still vitally important for the Fed to scare consumers, even though I think they're starting to notice a deceleration, because you can see it even in the employment data. Employers are returning to being in control. People are returning to the office. I think it's something close to 70% now, whereas during the entire pandemic, it was well below 40. You have power in the hands of the employer again. People looking for new employment and demanding more income. That is slowing. The pools of new talent is growing. All of that data is positive with regards to wage inflation, which has always been king tut, hardest thing to eliminate. If you can get wage inflation to just above where actual inflation is, the Fed's going to be satisfied and happy. That's what they want. So the Bank of Canada and the Fed, for that matter. That and obviously grocery prices coming back in line.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that, and there was a few viral TikToks and Instagram posts, whatever you want to call them, in regards to the continued discussion around affordability, and obviously just in North America in general. And I think a lot of this too, that doesn't, inflation coming back into normalcy and interest rates maybe starting to decline or at least stabilize and maybe be more predictable going forward. It's not necessarily changing the fact that we've now gotten to this stage, because again, I think that's one really important thing. It's like your yogurt that cost $3 a year ago is now, let's say, $5.50. Just because inflation comes back down to a normal rate doesn't mean that it's going back down to $3. So
No.
we got, new normal to deal with. It's more about the volatility around it. And I mean, I use yogurt as my example. Housing, buying a house in North America, we've talked about it. Like, we don't necessarily need to regurgitate everything that we've spoken about before, but I think there was a couple of, you had shared one with me. I'm not sure if you're going to have that in the newsletter or a link to in the newsletter, and essentially just comparing. I think it was what the kind of average down payment was, and the average rate, and the average payment, average mortgage payment between, was it 1970, 2000, or 1990, 2008, and then now. I also just saw some, even just in more of a short-term look, and say, let's say you have a $500,000 loan that was at 3%, and you qualified under a $70,000 annual salary to have that exact same home with the new rates. You would need to be making somewhere between $40,000 and $45,000, maybe more a year, to have qualified on that home. And so, obviously, as a consumer, you're like, well, how is that going to work?
Yeah.
Wage inflation, to your point, maybe is it higher. There was more demands. We saw it. I think if you run a business, you understand that your G&A costs for wages and salaries have gone up significantly in the past 2 years, but not to the same degree as what it's costing people for potentially a remortgaging at those kind of rates, depending on when you bought in. So
Yeah.
it's still a pretty big issue that, we alluded to it probably 9 months ago. I remember going through some Globe and Mail articles and you and I going back and forth on kind of the timing of this. And I think back then we said it's really going to be 2024 into 2025, like end of 23, all of 24 and into 25, when the glut of these mortgages are going to be refinancing. And obviously the Bank of Canada has an understanding of that data, and the Fed has an understanding of that data. We have the issues of,
in the United States, they don't really have this problem. They have 25-year mortgages that don't have to be refinanced.
Yeah, but the affordability is still an issue, and it's maybe just not as concentrated as we have, but it's still an issue. So,
but that's where their banks become weaker, because now they have all of these underwater mortgages that they're having to pay out, because you have these banks that are borrowing money at what was at 1.0 is now 5, and they've lent it out to all of these people. We'll call it 70% of the population at 3% over 30 years. And those people, we've seen the memes where the Leonardo DiCaprio, he's not leaving. They're not leaving their houses. There's going to be no turnover, which again, as a percentage of your population in an industry, real estate is a huge piece of the business. Yeah. You have unfortunately, a situation where you lose GDP, you have a lack of mobility. Those things are all bad for the economy. And in Canada, I actually believe, well, this is terrible short term. Long term, us having a more dynamic, it leads to a more dynamic market, a stronger banking system, a situation where we don't have banks that are undercapitalized because we have loans that are 30 years deep and they're borrowing at 5.5. So I don't know. There's counters to a lot of that. And,
yeah, for sure.
And for me, it is very obvious that this is painful. We've mentioned this multiple times. I think affordability and from a mortgage perspective is in that 4 range. 3.5 would be ideal. I'm hoping that in 2025 we have a 3.5. In October 2025, 3.5. Please God, let's do it. Give me a 4.5 prime -1 mortgage. That's all I want. Variable me. But generally speaking, I think that Canada's, while has a lot of headwinds, don't get me wrong, there is some advantages to us having a debt market that needs to be refinanced every once in a while, because it leads to better lending practices, it leads to a better capitalized system, and perhaps a less because when you see one of the big banks go under, it's just hell, right? Look at what happened in the United States. It almost took the entire world down. I think that we don't want to see that in Canada necessarily, and there is some benefits to that. Yeah. But
we won't mention the fact that we don't have enough homes to worry about again.
Yeah, we're not going to do that because, I mean...
I think Chrystia Freeland was... so Unusual Whales, always an interesting follow on Twitter, posted yesterday a quote from her. Canada absolutely can't build more houses without more immigrants. That's what she told the Globe and Mail in an article. Which, like, based on our discussions 2 weeks ago about all of this, and we were kind of going through some data, talking about new housing starts and whatnot, I guess that there can be some credence to that. We don't have enough people building homes, so we need more people to come in and start businesses and do that. I'm not sure if... I don't know this at all. This is anecdotal, or this is just a question. It's like, I'm not sure how many people that are immigrating into this country are going to be building homes.
I don't know.
Because we have a housing issue with the existing population. So if we continue to bring more people in... Is
she referring to the fact that they like to do the work?
I don't know. I don't know. This was obviously, I'm giving you this tweet live. I was just reading it.
Yeah, Chrystia Freeland probably put her foot in her mouth there, depending on what her meaning was.
Depending on the context
which she'll be able to
it.
dance around
post. 100%.
Which is good. Very important to be able to do.
The most important.
Yeah, Chrystia Freeland's always good at that. She's very... Anyways, the one last thing I want to talk about before we go out, and Trung Pham, probably one of my favorite financial tweeters, had a good little spiff on Disney and it turning 100 years old. So, I don't know, this was a couple days ago. And he had a what-if scenario with Warren Buffett.
Yeah.
And so Warren Buffett has dipped his toes into owning Disney for a long period of time. And Disney actually being a very poor investment versus the S&P 500 in its 100 years it's existed. So it's not been great. That's largely because it's at near 10-year lows right now, trading around $80. And I'm of the opinion that it's the premier brand in entertainment on the non-sports end, especially if you back out ESPN. And while all of the negative headwinds are obvious, their debt problem is clear. They're not going to claim Chapter 1. They can't allow those sorts of things. But there's a lot of problems that has to work through. But in this tweet thread, it just goes to, if you zoom out, Disney's still, holy crap, that is an insane investment. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. So an interesting what if for the company is Warren Buffett. Disney turned 100 years old today. He had a significant stake twice, but sold, and Warren has said that this is a huge mistake. The main deal was in 1966 when Buffett, at the age of 36, invested $4 million to acquire 5% of Disney for the Buffett partnership. He even flew down to California to meet Walt Disney before making the bet. $80 million was the valuation of the whole thing, Buffett later recalled. The Pirates of the Caribbean ride had just been put in at the cost of $17 million. Imagine my excitement. A company selling at only 5 times rides. He sold 1 year later after for a healthy 50% gain. But assuming he held, that would have been an $8 billion position, a 2,000x on $4 million, and would be probably considered one of Buffett's greatest investments. So shoulda, coulda, woulda. But for Buffett, it's a kind of a what if. And it talks about just taking money off the table. I think that, at least in my brain, selling 1 year later after a 50% gain, pretty darn good. But again, I think was probably something that he pulled on or has started to consider when he buys a lot of other businesses. So this is another time in which he entered the company in 1998. The Disney sale in the 60s was a huge mistake. I should have been buying. Forget about holding. That's happened many times. I mean, we think that anything we sell should go up substantially because we own good businesses. And we may sell them because we need money or for something else. But we still think they're good businesses. And we think good businesses are going to be worth more over time. That's why they like to hold. So everything I sold in the past, virtually, that I can think of, has gone on to sell at a lot more, for a lot more money. And I would expect that would continue to be the case. That's not a source of distress. But I must say that selling Disney was one of those mistakes. He has been involved with Disney again, once more. And that was again in 96 when they got 3.6% of Disney for $19 billion when they were acquiring the capital cities and ABC. And he kind of put all that deal together. I think that for me, what did I pull away from this? At least for myself, the only way that I believe I have any form of advantage over others is having a longer term view on markets and to have a better grasp on allocation. So investing in emerging markets or investing in the United States more than Canada. A lot of Canadians love to be 80% Canada, and then they get smoked because Canada's down 3% this year and the U.S. is up 18. You have all of these dynamics. But for myself, buying and owning brands that have staying power, that have moats, it is a test of fortitude to be able to hold through a lot of these bad events. And the debt problem for Disney is shocking. The cost of debt going up has made this very challenging. The world in which they overbet on Disney Plus because Disney Plus doesn't produce the same sort of margins that the rides do or that going to movies do, and then being able to resell IP over and over and over again. So think movie theaters, video stores, those sorts of things. They were extracting multiple times on pieces of content over and over and over again. They overplayed it through the pandemic. They produced the Marvel enterprise. I think, though, you let this cool down for a smidge. Do you think Disney's not going to be around in 50 years? My son is obsessed with Disney. So
as I look, you said like your advantage is taking a long-term look or having a long-term view, and I would agree with that. I think it's obviously then your job. It's required basically to look at, well, what is a good long-term hold? What companies are putting their roots down and entangling the consumer and holding you to that brand? And there are going to be bumps along the way, but who's going to be there in this example in the 100 years or in the 60 years since Warren made that investment? Obviously he looks back thinking like, why didn't I see the fact that this is going to just be obviously as entertainment, as the access to that entertainment continued to grow, and obviously there was one of the biggest players, especially in the family world. I mean, you can have massive productions in terms of
don't love families right
movies that are great with adults, but when you tie in kids and you have that lifetime, that brand awareness, it's insane.
Yeah.
And so speaking of that, just really quickly, I know we wanted to just touch on it just because it's kind of an interesting thing. Is it Netflix earnings call was last night? I believe you said 18%
up bigly after hours.
18% after
I haven't checked
hours
this morning, but
increases to their premium pricing up to $22.99. No one's batting an eye, and they've just recently announced their first live event that they're going to be doing, which is going to be this crossover. So they obviously have the relationships with the F1 and with golf with PGA, and they're doing kind of a crossover event to kick off the weekend of the inaugural Las Vegas Grand Prix that's happening in November. And they're going to be doing a live crossover golf event with kind of four PGA's professionals, I think all kind of the top 10s in the world kind of thing. guys and then 4 drivers that obviously play golf, and they're going to be a crossover. I talked to you about this before we started recording. I don't know how interesting that's going to be in terms of the content. I guess we'll have to see. Maybe they'll push them to be, obviously be doing some things that is going to be really entertaining. But
maybe some good interviews.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But interesting that they're going to be doing this live event for the first time. This is something that's new for Netflix. Obviously, they've built this relationship. Obviously, they know that a live sporting event is kind of maybe a quote unquote easy thing to do first, like this. And in terms of, there's plenty of examples of other productions or companies and conglomerates doing this.
If I'm a premium HD subscriber, there better not be a single ad in that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, other than what everyone's wearing, but yeah,
exactly.
Subliminal. Yeah. But that's going to be in November 14th, I think. So everyone's probably seen the ads for it. If you're scrolling on Twitter or Instagram, it's definitely around. But I think that's it. I mean, Netflix is such one of those stories you just talk about, like hitting bumps in the road, right?
Oh God, the equity has been all over the map,
Yeah.
and it's hard to hold. You have to believe in what you're modeling, and I don't know. It's easier to hit singles over a long period of time than it is to be a home run hitter, and that leads me to my my recommendation for the week. Making It in Real Estate. It's a book that I'm halfway through right now, and it's giving me a little bit of an appreciation for commercial. And as I continue to acquire commercial real estate clients, I want to know a little bit more about what they're doing.
It's very interesting.
It is very interesting. I went into the wrong business. But really good. A lot of lessons in it for me. And I recommend it to anybody listening here that wants to perhaps better understand whether or not they should be a property developer, or if they should be someone who does it on the side, or they are just going to do some up-down suites. I think it's a really great book for that. So again,
understanding it from your client's perspective too, right? I mean, just for advisors and for, professional help kind of thing, understanding that perspective. And,
that's literally our job.
Yeah.
As professional service providers. We need to know them to give them better advice. So, Cam, you got anything?
No, great record. I think I saw you put in Prof G's
Financial
interview.
advice.
Yeah, was that on Scott's Personal Finance, and he had was it this most recent week?
Yeah,
I'd assume. Yeah, so I also had watched that. That was a great little interview, or a great production. So I would recommend that as well.
Okay, Cam, I know you got to get going.
Talk to you next week.